Hey, y'all. In this video, we're going to talk about what is known as the Lost Cause myth, or more accurately, the Lost Cause mythology. And if you think that phrase sounds familiar to you, well, so do I, because growing up in the South, I heard that phrase all the time. I grew up hearing phrases like the Lost Cause and Lost Cause mythology and Lost Cause narrative and even Lost Cause blah blah. But I didn't really know what those phrases meant until one day, when my 5th grade teacher at the time told our class that the Civil War was about states' rights and not about slavery. And then when I got home from school, I asked my mother what he meant by that. And she said that that's just what it was about, states' rights. And then I asked her, what are states' rights? And she said, well, that's just states' rights. And then I asked her, well, what did the South want those states' rights for? And she said, well, they just wanted to be left alone. And then I asked her, but why did the North fight to stop them from being left alone? And she stopped talking. So that was that. But over the years, I've learned that what my mom was telling me was part of a larger narrative that historians now refer to as the Lost Cause mythology, or the Lost Cause narrative, which was popularized by white Southerners in the late 19th century and which dominated textbooks and monuments and public discourse in the South for over 100 years. So let's talk about that today. As always, but without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this video. The Lost Cause is a term used to describe the mythology or narrative that was created after the Civil War by white Southerners that rewrote the history of the Confederacy and the Civil War itself. At its core, the Lost Cause mythology claims that the Civil War was not fought over slavery, despite the fact that every Confederate leader and member of the Confederacy, including Jefferson Davis himself, stated explicitly that the war was fought to preserve slavery. No, the Lost Cause claims that the war was actually fought over states' rights. Oh, and also the Lost Cause mythology claims that the Confederacy and its leaders were noble and heroic, tragic figures whose cause was lost through no fault of their own. And it also claims that the enslaved people of the South were loyal and contented workers, who were held in bondage only for economic reasons, and who were ultimately saved from a life of misery by the Confederacy. Not to mention that they were also superior to other racial groups, and that white Southerners should continue to rule over them. The Lost Cause was first promoted in literature during the 1865 to 1890 period, known as the Troubled Reconstruction, when Southern writers began publishing novels and articles that minimize the role of slavery in the Civil War and instead emphasized the notion that the war was caused by a genuine but misguided sense of regional pride. In 1867, the Southern Historical Society was founded with the goal of collecting and publishing primary sources that would preserve the history of the Confederacy. But that mission quickly took a turn when members of the society started manipulating and misrepresenting the very sources they were tasked with preserving. For example, the Society's first major project was the publication of the official records of the Union and Confederate armies, which contained the minutes of meetings and orders of both sides of the conflict. However, when it came time to publish the minutes of the Confederate Congress, members of the Southern Historical Society pressured the editor to remove references to slavery and the institution of slavery altogether. As a result, the published minutes of the Confederate Congress downplayed the importance of slavery, making it seem as though the issue was merely tangential to the main goal of achieving independence from the Union. But it was long after that before other literary efforts began to emerge that outright rejected the official narrative of the federal government and reinterpreted the history of the Confederacy and the Civil War to fit the Lost Cause narrative. One of the earliest examples of this was a book called The Rise and Fall of the Confederate States of America, written by a man named Thomas R. Caseburg and published in 1879. In this book, Caseburg argued that although slavery was an important institution in the South, it had nothing whatsoever to do with the causes of the war, and instead, he claimed that the real issue was states' rights. He said that the South seceded because it felt that its rights as a state were being infringed upon by the federal government, but that Southerners would have been just as happy to maintain slavery if they had won the war and gained independence from the Union. But of course, they couldn't, because the North had too much industrial power and manpower. After that, a steady stream of Lost Cause novels began pouring out of the South that followed this same line of reasoning, such as The Lieutenant Colonel of the Black Horse Troop by John S. Steele Reese, a Southern Gullividian, by Mary Johnston and The Sword of the Avenger by John Pendleton Kennedy. This and Nobles, along with countless others that followed, presented a romanticized version of the Old South and the Civil War that was designed to appeal to the nostalgia of the white Southern audience. And the Lost Cause message was picked up by veterans groups like the Confederate Veterans Association, which erected monuments across the South that perpetuated the Lost Cause narrative. It was also taken up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which was founded in 1894. And this group had an even greater impact on perpetuating the Lost Cause mythology. Unlike other veterans groups, which were largely comprised of Confederate veterans themselves, the UDC was made up of female relatives of Confederate soldiers and therefore had no personal stake in the outcome of the Civil War. Instead, they were motivated by a desire to honor their family members and to preserve the legacy of the Confederacy. And they achieved this through erecting monuments, through influencing school curricula, and through organizing events and celebrations that promoted the Lost Cause mythology. For example, in 1903, the United Daughters of the Confederacy convinced the Virginia General Assembly to pass a law requiring the teaching of the Lost Cause version of history in all public schools, and many other Southern states followed suit. And since most of these states had very little in the way of public schools prior to the early 1900s, this meant that for the first time hundreds of thousands of children were being taught the Lost Cause version of history. This was very effective at embedding the Lost Cause in the minds of generations of Southerners, and it became so effective and so pervasive that it completely overshadowed any other interpretation of the Civil War for decades. And it was until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s that alternatives to the Lost Cause began to emerge. The Lost Cause was used to justify racial oppression, even after the passage of the 15th Amendment. The Lost Cause narrative continued to be used as a tool to justify racial oppression in the South. After Reconstruction ended in 1877, Southerners used the Lost Cause mythology to rationalize the creation of Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation in the South. By emphasizing the supposed cultural superiority of white Southerners and the contented nature of enslaved people, Lost Cause apologists argued that racial hierarchy was not only justified, but it was actually necessary for the progress and prosperity of the region. They claimed that slavery had been a positive good that benefited both the enslaved and the enslavers, and that Jim Crow laws were simply a continuation of that benevolent system. As the 20th century wore on, however, the Civil Rights Movement and the federal government's response to it gradually chipped away at the foundation of the Lost Cause. The publication of books, like The Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, helped to solidify the Lost Cause in the minds of Americans nationwide. But they also prompted responses that offered alternative perspectives. As the Civil Rights Movement gained momentum, activists and scholars began to challenge the Lost Cause narrative, emphasizing the centrality of slavery in causing the Civil War and highlighting the brutality of the Confederacy. Today, the Lost Cause has largely been discredited by historians, but its legacy continues to shape American culture and memory, and you can see it everywhere if you know what to look for. So if you want to learn more about that, I encourage you to check out some of my other videos on monuments and symbols of the Confederacy, which I'll link to right here. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing. You can follow me on social media or check out my website. And as always, if you've made it this far, please leave a comment down below telling me where you're from. And if you don't want to tell me where you're from, that's fine. Just leave a comment down below saying hello. So I hope you'll do that, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much.